Assalamu alaikum. This is lecture 15 of web design and development, and in this lecture we are going to study further about model view controller and its implementation in Laravel application. So here are the lecture contents. In this lecture I will briefly describe the concept of MVC once again. Then I will outline few concepts about routing in MVC application and how views and controllers work and how the model is binded with the application. So if you recall from the last lecture that MVC was defined using the three concepts: model, views and controllers. Model actually represent the backbone of your application. Usually these represent the entities of your application. For example, for any application you can have a company as an application entity, or a dog or a chair, etc. Or you can have a database of entities such as students, teachers, classes, etc. This next concept is views. Views actually represent the template that output your data to the end user, such as the login page with the given set of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So anything you view on your applications, it is represented as views in your MVC application. Controller play an important part, and they are like a traffic cop uh, that takes the HTTP request that is sent from the browser. That means user initiates the HTTP request and it is handled by controller. So when the controller receives the request, it actually fetches the right data out of database, which is represented as model, and then it validates the user input and eventually sends back a response to the user using a view. So you can see that the controller is managing the request from the user, and it is using the model and sending the user with a view. So there are certain HTTP methods that help you to achieve basic task in your web application. So we have already discussed HTTP methods in the discussion of HTML forms. They are very much similar in PHP application. The common methods or actions are represented here. First of all, we have a method called get, and usually it is retrieved by the URL called task. However, you are free to use any other URL name. The controller method usually for getting all the tasks or all the basic information about the entity is accessed through index method, and it is named as task.indexed, and it shows all the tasks. For example, if we're taking example of a task as an entity, if you want to create a new task, or if you want to add or insert a new entity and instance in your database, you can do another method called get, and you can use the create URL, and it can be achieved by the create method of controller method, and it can be named as task or create, and it helps you to create a new task form in which you have the input fields to create a new task. Similarly, if you want to save something on the server, you will require a post method as done in the example 3, and it is accessed using the same method called URL called task, and you can use the store method of your controller, and it will accept the form submission and it will create a new task instance on your database. Similarly, you can view a single task by providing a bracket task ID that will be the ID of a task stored on a server. So it will show one task, and similarly you can edit the task provided by the same ID, and it will help you to edit one task. Put and patch are similar to the post method, and you can update the existing data, and you can append the data on the server. And delete is the opposite of insertion, and in this way you can delete a specific task by specifying the ID of your task, and you can use the destroy method, and the form HTTP method will be delete. This leads us to the definition of routing. MVC application use the routing system for URL map to controller and action. That means all the HTTP methods and the controller methods are linked together to perform specific task on server. It can be a get task such as fetching some data, fetching a page or creating a new page, or it can be a post tasks such as creating a new task on the server and adding data using the put or patch HTTP methods. So for each HTTP action, there must be a controller or a method in the controller that help you to achieve the task against such action. So that action is called a route. A route is a rule that is used to decide how a request is handled. So you can request any of the following URLs and they will be directed to index action on your home controller. So for example, if you take the base route uh, such as your application name and it is followed by a slash, that means you are accessing the root of your application. Again, it is similar to the slash home and slash home slash index. So this is the most typical form of accessing a URL on your web application. So usually the first part describes the controller and the second part describes the action in the controller. For in this case we have a home controller, and in home controller we have a index method. So index method is the default method. That means if you do not specify a method, index method will be called by default. For in this case, if you only specify the home controller in your URL, the index method will be called. Similarly, if you do not specify any of the controller or a method, then the default controller is the home controller, which will be specified in the bootstrap of your application, and then when the default controller home is selected, then the default method index will be called. So routing is like real routes. It is just like a traffic routes. For example, or you want to access a specific part of your city, so you have to follow certain roads to reach that part of the city. So similarly, if you want to access a certain part of your application, you have to follow certain paths or URLs to find out or access that part of application. So routing is a method to specify paths, URLs, and resources of any web application. So there are two main files that contain the roots of your application in PHP Laravel application. So if you want to create a PHP API, then you can access the roots in the roots slash api.php file. That means in your home directory of your application, access the roots folder, and then there will be file of api.php. And then for accessing it as a web application, that means if you want to access it using a normal browser URL, then you can do it in the another file which is also stored in the roots folder of your application. And the name of the file will be web.php. So if you open the second file in this case, which we are going to use for this part of lecture, you will be able to see one at least one root of this type. So it is started by a keyword root, that means specify that it is a root, and then there is a method, it is a HTTP method, and in this case it is a get method, and then you specify a path, and in this case only backslash, so forward slash is used, that means you are going to access the home directory of your application. Then you have specified a function that you want to do, perform some calculation, and uh, then want to return this part. So the calculation is very simple. In this case, we have only one statement which says return hello world. So it is the simplest form of a root, and it will show only hello world on the page if you access the base root of your application. You can use any kind of function here. You can perform the calculation, or you can link this root to a controller and with a function of a controller, and which can perform further actions, and it can link the data with your roots and your controller. So here are some typical examples of roots. Uh, you do not have to actually implement these roots at the moment. These are some examples for your understanding. So the first example was very simple, that we have a root, and it is again a get method, and which want to specify the base of our application. So at the function point, now we have changed function to a controller method. That means whenever we want to access the root of our application, we will direct it to home controller, and at the rate symbol is used to specify the method for that controller, and the method we are going to use is index. So that means whenever you want to access the base of your application, the home controller's index method will be called, and any functionality in the index method will be implemented, and the result will be sent back to the user in the form of response. Again, the next method is also a get method, and if you want to access the home URL, you have the same controller method. Next method is a again is a get method, and in this method we have uh, URL name services slash ID. So whenever we use a root in a curly braces, that means that uh, that is a placeholder. That means uh, you want a value from the user. For example, in this case we can get the services slash id, so we assume that id will be a number, so we can expect that the url will be in the form of services slash a number. It can be 1 2 3 or any number, and the question mark with the number says that it is an optional number. That means if the user specifies a number, the same URL will be accessed, and if your user does not specify the number, it will be accessible without the number. So it is an optional part, and it is a placeholder. That means you can put any value here. If we move to the next part, again home controller is called. Now the services method is used to access the URL is with this. So here is an important application, that you are restricting this URL or path to only verified user. So it is very easy to achieve uh, this kind of functionality in PHP, that you have added a middleware called verified, and only verified user will be able to access this URL. So if the user is not verified, you will be automatically directed to a page that will say you that you have to verify your account to access this page or the resource of the application. Similarly, Another URL is also a get method, and it says that you want to get the contact us path, and it specifies a function, and in this case you can return a view called contact us. So it is another way of specifying a URL or a route. If you look at the next example, it is a route with the post method, and it says that you have a path called blog slash post slash an placeholder. That means you want to specify a number of a post or a name of a post, and then you want to access the comment of that ID of the post. That means you want to make the comment on your any application or any post. So in this case you have the home controller, and you want to access the method make a comment, and in this case you have the middleware called authenticated. So that means if your user is authorized, I mean if he is logged in your application with a valid username and password, then he will be able to make a comment. So at this moment, to just take the consideration of the difference between verified and authenticated. A user is authenticated when a user has a valid username and a password in your application. A user is verified when the user has a valid name and a password, and then the email is verified from the by sending some email to your email account, and then you verify it by clicking on a button or using some kind of ID check. So next resource is next route is very much important to consider. It is a resource kind of route. That means you can create all the possible actions such as insert, update, delete with the resource route. So in this case you have a route called edit profile, and now the controller is changed. That means you want to access the user controller only. So take the difference here that you do not have to specify any method with the resource controllers. That means the methods are predefined, that insert, update, delete, index. These are methods are already defined, and you do not have to define the routes for resource controllers. And again, you have added the middleware authenticated. Similarly, you can group a number of routes using the root group method, and you have specified that every URL in this group will be prefixed with the admin. That means only admin user will be able to access this group of URL. Again, the namespace is admin, which is not of very much concern. Middleware is again authenticated, that only authenticated user will be able to access. And in this group, you have a root of resources for a post, and you have post controller with the middleware only admin. So to access the URL routes in your views, you want to name the routes. The simplest way to refer the routes anywhere in the application is using by the relative or absolute URL path. However, route can also be used by their names. So this example shows the how you can name a route. For example, you have a route clause called home slash new, and it is accessed by home controller new method, and it is named as home dot new. So whenever you want to access this route, you can call the root method in your view and call the home dot new. So this route will be accessible in the hyperreference of your anchor tag. So these two curly braces are used to actually execute a PHP code in your HTML file, and these are equivalent to the sign we have used earlier, that is was question mark PHP and question mark ending with the braces. So there are other kinds of routes as well. Signed routes are useful when you want to send the notification, such as if you want to send a password reset to an email ID of a user, or if you want to send a notification or some invitation or verifying account, you should be doing by using the signed route. So here is an example of simple route, which is a URL and it is a route, and it is named as invitation, and there is an array with the invitation ID, and the answer is yes. You can do it by a signed route, and it will be a notification or an invitation sent to the user, and it will have the same uh, parameters. Alternatively, you can create a temporary signed route. So this will help you to create a route that will be valid only for some time. That means if you want to verify an account, you can use a temporary signed route, and you can say that this route will be only valid for the 24 hours, or up to any hours you want to add. For example, the same route is sent by temporary signed route, and it is again an invitation route, and now uh, the time is accessed using the now method, and you have added the 24 hours for its duration, and the rest of the method is the same. So the links can be protected using the signed middleware for blocking the unauthorized access. So we will cover the views in the next chapter. So here are here is a brief concept about the views in the MVC. Views are returned by the routes directly, as you have seen one example in the above, or the controllers return the views by processing the request. Views are the files describing how the output will look like, and there are two types of views in the Laravel. There are simple plain PHP views, and there is a blade templating views. We will cover both in the next lecture. So views can be simple or embedded with arguments. For example, if you look at the URL root.get efforts, and we have a function which is called the return frontend dot offer. So it is a simple view. Alternatively, if you see the next example, it is taken from a controller method, and it says that you have a variable post, and you get the post with the user category tags and comments, and you paginate it by 10, and you return the view with the methods, and which contain the name of the view, and it contains some compact post which you access from the database. So as discussed earlier, controllers are like traffic codes. So all the route map to actions defined in controllers. So in MVC pattern, incoming requests are handled by controllers. So as you have seen earlier in the routes, that whenever you specify a URL, you can direct it to a action in the controller. So controller are PHP files again, usually inherit in from app slash http slash controller, which is the built-in MVC base. So you can view this controller, but I would suggest to open it and do not change any of the code in this file. However, you can create your own controller using the command php artisan make colon controller, and then specify the name of your controller. So it is a good practice to name your controller with any name followed by the word controller. So for example, if you have seen the user and then was followed by controller user, controller home, controller. So each public method in the controller is known as an action method, and it means you can invoke it from the web using some URL to perform an action. So getting the input from the user is a common task in web application, and it is referred as the second most common task of controllers is to get input from the user. Do you remember what is the first most common task of the controller? It is to get the URLs from the users. So which is provided, the input is provided through an HTML form. The input is collected and stored through the post action of the web page and the root. So here is a typical example. For example, you have a root with the method post, and you have a task and URL, and you have a task controller, and the method is stored. So whenever you have a form that is linked or submitted with this method to the server, and it will eventually called the store method. In the store method, you can access the input created in the request. So the input is collected through the request created by the browser. So the request method is accessible to you in the controller. So you can create a new task, and you can do it by accessing request and the property of title and description, which may be sent from the user from a browser. So as discussed earlier, the resource controller is the controller in which you do not have to specify the method names. Sometimes it is very difficult to name the controller actions, and you want the application to do it on your behalf. So Laravel provides the predefined names for controllers method being used in the CRUD application called resource controllers. So you can create the resource controller using the same kind of command as earlier. It is PHP artisan make colon controller, controller name, and then if you want to create the controller as a resource controller, you can specify double hyphen and resource to make it a resource controller. So this can be viewed in the routes defined above. So whenever you run this command, you will have a new route in your routes file. So you can also do the route to model binding. So one of the most common routing pattern is finding resource with a given ID. For example, you want to search a specific user, you want to search a specific student. In this example, you are searching a specific conference. So you have a route called with the get method, and you have the conference slash ID placeholder. That means you will specify a conference slash ID, a number or a text. So you can use this number to find out the conference by using the find or fail method and specifying this ID, and then you can use this conference for your own purpose in the application. So the above method is called implicit route binding. Other way, a custom response can also be sent using the response method provided by the Laravel. So we will cover the response methods in a different lecture. So that is end of today's lecture. If you want to study more, you can read the chapter 3 of the recommended book, and if you have any question, you can ask me through a designated conduct question and answer session. Thank you very much.